Welcome to Shelter and Solidarity, a deep dive with artists, activists, and authors during this ongoing COVID pandemic. I'm one of your hosts today, Joe Ramsey, live streaming here, Facebook Live and YouTubing with you here from Dorchester, Massachusetts on the south side of Boston, as we begin a very important show, Beyond Putin, Beyond NATO, Grasping the War in Ukraine. We ask you to join our live discussion today. Please, and a live discussion does require that people mute their microphones. So we are on Zoom here. If you are heard, you will be seen. And we ask you all to be respectful of that space. In about an hour, we will welcome all of you, our live Zoom participants, into this discussion. But for now, we will be having a great discussion with our 5 guests and one very special co-host who is joining me today, Avi Chomsky, Professor Aviva Chomsky, who is Professor of History and Coordinator of Latin American Studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. Her books include Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration. And her next book, due out in April, is entitled, Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice. Avi, thank you so much for being back with us here on Shelter and Solidarity. And of course, you need to unmute, Avi. You heard, let's try that again. Welcome back, Avi, to Shelter and Solidarity.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for having me back on the show. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Now, Avi, I think this is your 3rd or 4th time, at least on the show as a guest. Usually we've had you on topics of your own expertise, focused on issues of imperialism, Latin America. Today, you are stepping into a co-hosting role, and as we were talking a little bit before the show, on a topic that is not, for either of us, our area of primary expertise, but nonetheless is an issue that many of us have been forced to try to bone up on and learn about over the last couple of weeks and the last month or a bit longer. Avi, I wanted to just welcome you and ask you to say a little bit about what the last month has been like for you, trying to kind of navigate and build expertise and knowledge about this topic in relationship to your long-standing history as a scholar and activist and an anti-imperialist in the belly of the beast here. What has this last month been like for you, making sense of this Ukraine crisis?
So, yeah, I come at this from my perspective as a Latin Americanist and a student of Latin American history and a professor of Latin American history. And in studying Latin American history, obviously, trying to understand both U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy towards Latin America, the many levels of U.S. policy towards Latin America is a really important issue. And also trying to understand U.S. public opinion is a really important issue, and how U.S. public opinion is formed and how U.S. propaganda works about Latin America. Not only towards Latin America, but having lived through numerous other US wars, one of the things that has always shocked me is how gullible the US public is, and how when the United States has decided to engage in unprovoked aggression against other countries, how easy it frequently is for the US population to just jump right on the bandwagon. One of the interesting things about Central America, which is one of the cases that I have studied a lot, is how the solidarity movement developed, and actually there was a fair degree of pushback against US policy. But then, watching 2001, 2003, just feeling like, wow, has everyone around me jumped on the bandwagon? Like, how can this be that this sort of war fever grips the population so easily? And the US goes to war and everybody just wants to be behind it. So a lot of what I've been thinking about is how US propaganda has been working in this particular war. And a lot of what it does is shut down discussion, decontextualize, deny history. And this is very familiar from US interventions in Latin America as well. But I just wanted to mention 4 words that I found so frustrating because they're repeated endlessly, and I feel have served to prevent analysis or discussion. One is unprovoked. Every single time we hear about this unprovoked Russian invasion. And I feel that term is being used to say history doesn't matter, causality doesn't matter, analysis doesn't matter. We're just going to stick with this word that basically is saying Russia is terrible and we don't want to hear anything else. Well, as a historian, obviously every historical event has causes, and if we want to act in the world, we need to understand historical causality, and so that's really frustrating. Another term that I feel is being way sort of overused in this is sovereign, as if sovereignty was something absolute and categorical, and we all know exactly what it is. But when you start to take it apart, and especially coming from the perspective of Latin America, there is no such thing as absolute sovereignty. Sovereignty is always, every nation state is multi-ethnic and multicultural and has internal differences. And every nation state is subject to US hegemony, really, in the modern world in different ways, through international financial institutions, through USAID, through NGOs, neoliberalism, trade agreements. So both internally and globally, sovereignty is complicated. So we shouldn't be using it as a way of, so a violation, well, there's lots of violations of different kinds of violations of sovereignty. And certainly the United States has been quite involved in Ukraine, as it has in Latin America, without necessarily engaging in a ground invasion. That's not the only kind of intervention that exists. Territorial integrity goes along with sovereignty, that again is being sort of held up as this absolute, like we have to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. But again, every nation state has different ways of managing regional and ethnic divisions in their own countries. And even if you look at the United States, we have like Indian reservations, we have states that have different degrees of self-governance inside the federal system. And, you know, Latin American countries are proposing concepts of plurinationalism, international law protecting indigenous rights. So there's all kinds of ways that territorial integrity is more complicated than we're being asked to think about it. And finally, of course, democracy. That is a country with a very complicated politics like Ukraine, but pretty much every Latin American country and the United States, there's no such thing as an absolute of democracy there, where we have these paragons out there that this is just exactly the ideal form of governance. Every so-called democracy has undemocratic aspects to it, and ours certainly does, and Ukraine's certainly does. So positing this as a conflict between democracy and autocracy, I think, is also a way of, it's more propaganda than anything else. So those are some of the issues I've been thinking about.
Yeah, Avi, I think that it's really a powerful opening. I think really useful framework. I mean, your state, you're kind of marking some of these absolutized terms, right? You're not saying that these terms can't be used in a particular critique or analysis, that there isn't something to be defended about a certain notion of sovereignty, but this sense in which to even use put these terms in quotation marks, or even to kind of locate them, is already a kind of betrayal of one's absolute moral duty in the present. I think that is so important to kind of identify from the outset, before we turn towards, you know, our experts and those who are experiencing the events firsthand that we're going to be talking about today, to locate this discussion. Really, and we wanted to emphasize that we're not trying to just lay out the definitive shelter and solidarity line on the war in Ukraine today, but to start a conversation that hopefully will go on beyond today, including with hopefully some of the guests and maybe some of you in the audience today, as we continue to try to make sense of issues and a region of the world that maybe many of us haven't been paying enough attention to. I'm reminded here, kind of shamefully, of that Mark Twain quote from a century ago, an older anti-imperialist who said, right, God invented wars so Americans could learn geography. And again, I mean, I think that's something we can take of as applying to the American kind of jingoistic culture more generally. But I think even those on us on the left are sometimes playing catch up. We can't keep up on everything as deep as we are wherever we are. So I want to start to bring in some of the expert voices that we have today. And we actually are going to have 4 live guests joining us and 1 guest joining by video. We're actually going to start With her, Alisa LaSotnik was born in Lviv, Ukraine, is a Russian Ukrainian from a Russian Ukrainian Jewish family who raised abroad, currently in Spain, but working with refugee support, and is actually on call for a trip back to Lviv to support Ukrainian war refugees as we speak. For that reason, she is not able to be with us today, but we will be hearing a 5-minute video and maybe another one later from her to kind of set the stage a bit. But I figure we can just introduce all the speakers right now before we go to Alisa's, I think, very powerful opening video. After Alisa LaSotnik, we will have Olena Lyubchenko, originally from Eastern Ukraine. Olena is a PhD candidate in political science at York University, Toronto. Her research interests include neoliberal restructuring, dispossession, and financialization of social reproduction, as well as struggles around life-making. Her dissertation draws on social reproduction, feminism, and traces the transformation of the gender contract and social citizenship from the Soviet to the post-Soviet era in Russia. Olena, are you there? Make sure we can unmute Olena for.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, great. As we know on Zoom here, we only see you when we hear you. Avi, you can introduce the next speaker, please.
Okay, so the next speaker will be Jonathan Feldman, who is a professor of economic history and international relations at Stockholm University. And his research specializes in political economy, disarmament, green economics, and studies related to democracy. And finally, the last speaker, Suzi Weissman, is professor of politics at St. Mary's College in California. She's the author of Victor Serge, a political biography, and she hosts the Jacobin radio podcast and broadcasts weekly, the weekly program Beneath the Surface on KPFK in Los Angeles.
Great. We actually will have one speaker after that. That was Avi's last speaker. Keti
sorry.
Chukrov actually is an associate professor at the School of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, Russia. Her latest book, Practicing the Good, Desire, and Boredom in Soviet Socialism from 2020 from University of Minnesota Press, deals with the impact of socialist political economy on the epistemes of historical socialism. And to Keti and all of our guests today, thank you so much for being here. I think we have a rare mix of expertise and talent here today, including voices from the Ukraine, from Russia, experts in European energy politics and beyond. So just thank you all for being here. All right, I'm going to cue our producer, Seren, to actually lay Alisa's video on us. Seren, could you play it for us? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me part of this conversation. And I apologize for not connecting live. I need to be on alert in case of possible evacuation efforts. Ukraine has been simmering in tensions of East and West for centuries. It is the last frontier that has not become a satellite of Russia or absorbed into the EU, and it's facing this perennial dilemma of freedom from and freedom for. Clearly, it wants to be free from the pressures of Russia that have been oppressing the language and the culture and the political development really for centuries, from the Tsars to the Soviet Union and since independence. But freedom for what? Even as it's standing for its sovereignty under the current conflict, it's scrambling to gain entry into the EU and NATO. And unfortunately, countries that are largely agricultural, like Greece and Spain, haven't fared well in EU. Apart from that, the pandemic, we've seen this across-the-board failure of governments to place human needs above economic interests, really challenging the notion of Western-style democracy at its core. And if it does become a part of NATO, and I'm sure other panelists will address this, we would be placing two nuclear powers side by side with potentially catastrophic consequences in the future. And although it's being rejected by both entities at the moment, it's in such a precarious position that begs the question of what does self-determination or sovereignty look like in today's world in a neighborhood of bullies. Going into this conflict, Ukraine is quite a poor country. I mean, since the pandemic, 45% of the population is poor. It's riddled with corruption and oligarchs and lacks social cohesion. The result of historical consequences in the Soviet Union, people of Russian descent were forcefully migrated into Ukraine, and so now there's a population within the country that feels, aligned with the Russian nexus of commerce. And it stands to reason that as the country is contemplating and deliberately placing itself on a path to enter the EU, there needs to be a kind of reorganization that's preferably diplomatic and not through war, as there are people who are vehemently opposed to being part of the EU. At the same time, it must be said that this polarization of Ukrainians and Russians is greatly manufactured by politicians over decades. And if you peel back the political rhetoric and the peripheral pressures, you see peoples who are quite capable of breaking bread together, and quite often do. In my own family, my Ukrainian grandmother from the East married a Russian man from the West. Their child, my mother, married my father of Jewish descent, his family, and we later migrated to US with the piano in E5, a relic of that Soviet era and transition. And today on the ground, we see a stream of refugees from all corners of the country grabbing their essentials and transitioning towards the border in the west. Green corridors have been established, but not successfully in all places. People in the Donetsk in the eastern territories are having a very hard time finding safe evacuation routes. But people from all over the country are grabbing tiny suitcases and just leaving everything they know behind, not knowing where this war will go. And men have been drafted into the army, so anyone from 18 to 60s recruited to serve. So predominantly we see women with children, grandparents, some pets, taking days in order to cross over to Poland or Slovakia, which fortunately had opened their borders, although there's a point of saturation recently that required people to come back. And also bear in mind it's the thick of winter. It's slightly above 30 in the day, but well below at night. And the just humanitarian crisis just likely to get exacerbated and deepen as if peace accords are not signed and Ukraine enters a prolonged and devastating war.
And that again was Alisa LaSotnik, who wanted to be here live with us today, but actually has to be on call, on alert to support Ukrainian war refugees from her position in Spain right now, where she is working to help people resettle and find support. I'd like to, that's a very, I think, just sobering and very moving short video from Alisa. And again, Alisa, when you're watching this, I just hope that you are safe and your loved ones and those that are in need right now are getting as much care as they need and that they can get. And we will hear again from Alisa later in the program about some of the things from her perspective that can or must be done or not done in this moment to try to improve the conditions of these people that she's in touch with. I want to bring in Olena as as we move to our live panel here in light of Alisa's remarks. Olena, we've asked all of our panel today to begin by responding with between 3 and 5 minutes to a kind of broad question. The question we put to you was, what is the current situation regarding Ukraine as you see it right now? How did we get to this point? And what are you able to see from your position, geographic, scholarly position, about the current crisis that you think needs to be more widely known? Olena, please.
Hi, thank you all for coming to this panel today. I definitely appreciate the invitation. I was running late. I was also on the phone with my relatives, my cousins who are crossing into Poland today and then trying to get into Sweden tomorrow. So this is what what the situation is like for me. But yes, Joe, as you've said, as historical materialists, as Marxist feminists, people on the left who understand that where we are located within, social relations of class, race and gender, it does matter, right? In terms of how we are shaped politically. And so I have to situate my own, self and what it informs my views on Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine, but also this 8-year war. So I come from Eastern Ukraine. This is a region of coal miners, metallurgy and agricultural workers spread over. Oh, do I need to speak up?
I can hear you just fine. That
No?
might have
Okay.
been from earlier.
Spread over. So, okay. Yes, this is a region in Lugansk and Donetsk today, the Lugansk and Donetsk Oblasti. So I'm from Lugansk, and a lot of my family is from Mariupol, which has been on the news a lot. But I've spent my teenage and adult life in Toronto, Canada, where I live, where I immigrated with my mother. So my own politicization has taken place in this kind of in multiracial, diverse working class neighborhoods of Toronto. So today, while my cousins, my grandparents are dealing with physical threat of the war in Ukraine, I of course speak about Ukraine from a place of my own relative, physical and material safety, right? And so this is important to know before I begin. So Joseph asked me to speak about the particular Eastern European Eastern European and Eastern Ukrainian vantage point, if there is one, of course. So maybe some of you have seen this new book by Godsey and Ornstein. It's called Taking Stock of Shock. They speak about a nostalgia for the Soviet past and how people have related to the shock therapy reforms in the 90s, but also the kind of austerity measures that have taken place since then in Eastern Europe, right? Including Ukraine, including Russia, and so on. And, this is the way I would describe my Ukrainian relatives, people who live in Eastern Ukraine, kind of, Soviet Ukrainians, very plural, who are nostalgic for the Soviet past because of the deindustrialization, the poverty that shock therapy reforms have brought in waves, including the increasingly, austerity measures and militarization since 2014. And my own views on the war in Ukraine right now very much are reflected in the Left-East statement denouncing Putin's invasion, and perhaps some of you have seen it. But I think the most clearly articulated it's in the phrase that we've published. It's called "We said no to Russia today and no to the false choice between Russia and NATO tomorrow." But to further kind of expand on this, I would like to take kind of an anti-racist, feminist, again, social reproduction perspective on this. I think it's necessary to ask what, and Alisa has said this already in the video that we just watched. I think it's necessary to ask, what is Ukraine as a political project 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, before this invasion? And so I think we need to situate the war in Ukraine within the context of Ukraine's place in global social reproduction. I think the processes of militarization since 2014 have been intimately linked, right? Like intimately related and justified, intimately related to austerity measures in Ukraine, which have burdened households and especially women in Ukraine, both in Eastern and Western and Central Ukraine, everywhere. So the already impoverished population of Ukraine today, lacking resources in the kind of precarious, public sector and healthcare, subsidizing the war effort with household labor and resources, right? And socializing the costs of war and defense at the expense of people's lives. The rise in the state's national security spending has been, in a sense, again, socialized through austerity budgets justified by the war, right? The IMF placed strict limits on social spending. So this is fuel subsidies in the winter, health, education, social services, but abolition of monthly child assistance benefits to women, pension reform, right? And they refused to place similar limits on military and war spending by the Ukrainian state. The online leftist Ukrainian journal Commons, or Spilne, has done an amazing research really on the neoliberal reforms in Ukraine in the last 30 years, and I urge you to check it out. So 67% of Ukrainian households in 2021 characterized themselves as poor. Ukraine's pension fund has accumulated a debt of about $3.5 billion US owed to the pensioners who live in the non-government controlled areas, right, in Lugansk and Donetsk. So, you know, many households have sent migrant laborers to Poland, to Western Europe, to Canada, and have depended on remittances to reproduce themselves in this time since 2014, especially since 2014. And, you know, these are Ukrainian mothers and grandmothers that have been working as foreign domestic workers, leaving their families behind, cleaning Italian, German, Polish, American, Canadian rich homes, and doing dirty, usually dirty social reproductive work for the Western kind of white woman. And when Ukrainian refugees today are greeted with open arms in the EU, as Syrian and Iraqi and Yemeni people die outside, I think we need to understand, how racialized citizenship and membership has been reproduces precarity and exclusion and insecurity for some, right? And so how, you know, Ukrainian working class people, how they're being rewritten and instrumentalized within global capitalism today. So living in Toronto, in Canada, I harbor no illusions about the liberal democratic state and society, right? We cannot separate race and class here, and gendered labor, and how now Ukrainians are seen as white and, you know, valuable workers at the exclusion of others. So, you know, I think Du Bois's idea of the psychological wage of poor, exploited, and expropriated workers shed some light on this matter. Thank you, and I'm sorry I got so emotional.
No, Olena, please don't apologize. I mean, that was both really insightful, but also really moving. And I think it's wrong to not have emotional responses to some of these issues. You really highlighted so much, and I hope we can loop back for more detail about some of these issues with you in a bit. But just one brief comment, which is that the militarized narrative that we often get, the idea that the only way to support a country is through military aid and military spending, right, leaves out, you've just highlighted something that gets left out of that, right? When the funding goes to military spending and not social reproductive needs, right, who's hurt by that, right? What's the class and the gender effect of that, right? When these policy decisions are made prior to this recent, you know, the invasion, even, as you point out, right, when the funding and the nature of the state is to focus on militarism in any country, who's really hurt by that? And it seems like, and who's rendered invisible by narratives that assume military responses are the only kind of responses that matter. Thank you, Olena. Avi, did you want to respond briefly to Olena before we move on to Jonathan? You are muted still. Oh, sorry, I just muted. Okay, do it again. There you go. Okay, there we go, Avi.
No, I was just reflecting also on the concept of sovereignty and how very compromised Ukraine's sovereignty has been for a long time. And the idea that through not only by the USSR, but in the post-Soviet period, by international financial institutions and foreign interests and foreign investors, and that just thinking about how that reflected to the issue of sovereignty, because of course this is very similar to Latin America in many ways. That is, countries that are technically sovereign, but really have where governments cannot make decisions in the interest of their populations because these external institutions control what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Avi. In that area, your area of expertise in Latin America becomes especially relevant. We're going to bring in Jonathan Feldman now, again for another, I think, a take on, you know, kind of beneath the headline take, looking with an expertise in political economy, green economics, and issues related to democracy across Europe. Jonathan Feldman, what is this seems most pressing about the situation around Ukraine for you right now? What do you want to highlight from that situation? What do you see as it's kind of maybe behind this, beyond the headlines, kind of context and causality that we need to be attending to here? Jonathan?
Okay, thank you for having me here, fellow Americans. I'm located in Sweden, so a bit close to this. I just throw out some random things. Part of this Ukraine thing is affecting Sweden in a rather negative way. All the political parties have lined up behind arms shipments to Ukraine, whereas the DSA was very clear against this. In Sweden, even the left party, the one party to vote against the initial shipment, has now recanted, and they're for it. And we have this triangle now in the Swedish context, which is arms budget increases, everybody's for it. Arms transfers, everybody's for it. The divide is on NATO, yet these three things are going together. The reason why this is important is historically Sweden has provided a kind of third way, even though they were informally aligned with the US, to promote themselves as a so-called moral superpower and to promote and engage in the diplomatic solution. So what we see now is this kind of option has been kind of crushed or set back. I myself have tried to resist this and activate myself to do something. And I got a breakthrough when I was interviewed in the leading paper to try to show some other way. From the US perspective, I think the Ukraine story is somewhat new, but the basis for this crisis is rather old. I got my first break in left publishing with Michael Albert, who kindly agreed to publish my book, for which I'm thankful. And guess who helped me get that published? Noam Chomsky. So what was the book about? It was called Universities in the Business of Repression, the Academic Military Industrial Complex in Central America. And it was about how our universities are supporting pillars for militarism. The universities are just one of several actors behind this. And there's a very interesting interview with Studs Terkel that I cited in my Portside piece about military managerialism. And this interview was after Seymour Melman's book around 1970 or so, called Pentagon Capitalism. What the military does is it colonizes and extends its managerial power throughout the globe. And in the United States, it's colonizing economic, political, media, university, and other kinds of institutions. And what we need to do is move the thing that's most on the agenda, I think, in the US context, is how to delink these militarized institutions, be they economic, political, media, et cetera, and the universities, and make them go into something civilian. I've recently published a piece about this, about the Greta Thunberg effect and the ability to green universities. We need to at least be active in one institution, which could delink from the process of militarism, to a certain extent capitalism, and this dystopian ecological future. So we have a kind of strategic crisis. It's very, very interesting how in one of the more progressive countries in Europe, if not the world, we have a rally around the flag effect to support gross militarism. The reason why is because there's been a social amnesia and an intellectual abdication of some of the essential ideas of how to get around this related to reconstruction, economic and social reconstruction. This is deteriorated. I don't think, even though I am not a big fan of capitalism, I don't think we can reduce this to just capitalism and imperialism. There are state bureaucratic functions. There are very vicious and evil people who got in control over the Russian state. And the Biden administration, God bless them on their attempt to get something like Green New Deal, fell into this militarist trap in a very bad way. It's rather ironic that in the US you have the left, or some people call the far left. I myself call myself a northerner, looking down at some of the limits of the left and the right, but that's just my little joke. But anyway, you have the left, and then you have parts of the right debating this. And I don't know, the center seems totally confused, but this is not a coincidence. It has to do with certain people gaining certain power in the universities, pushing out certain kinds of critical ideas, dumbing down, post-truth. I mean, there's a whole set of factors. What I think is most important in Sweden or the United States or just about anywhere is to figure out how to get like Ramsey, get control of at least one institution and try to influence it. What's happening now in Sweden is the far right. First, they wanted to get rid of public television. Now they're trying to take it over. This is very, very dangerous. I think that there's an intellectual crisis within the left and that they have not been able to think systematically about how to get power threshold. I also think that while it may sound abstract and remove, the work that's being done in economic democracy by people like Michael Albert and others is essentially important, because we need to democratize the economic space in order to have a media platform. All these things, political, media, and economic democracy, flow together. And what's happening now is the military is extending its scope economically, politically, and media-wise. There's exchanges of capital to sustain and promote this. And so we need a different kind of accumulation system based on the green transformation and the Green New Deal, as well as the economic transformation. And there are models for how this goes. I could talk for hours, but I think I used up my time.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is a really fascinating perspective. And I hope that when we loop back in our next round of questions, once we open up Q&A and then we come back to the panel about what is to be done, I'd love to hear more about this notion of delinking and what that can look like concretely, delinking from militarism. I know that many, but not all on this call have some connection to higher education institutions in the United States and beyond. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that a bit later, among other things. We should have you back on the show for a full hour sometime.
Can I just say one very brief thing?
Yes.
One very important part of the Swedish debate, and I guess it extends to the US, is this question of the effectiveness of these military weapons and what effect they actually have. It is extremely important because this is how things are being debated here, and I would imagine the US. And the question is whether there are limits to military power, whether the arms shipments are defending the Ukrainians or extending the cycle of violence. I know some of you are aware of, I think it was Kinzer in the Boston Globe, had a very, very important, brilliant, the best thing practically I've ever seen about this. And so I think that has to be brought into the discussion, because there are people in the left who are being trapped into the cycle of militarism. And my hero or heroine, Simone Weil, was very, very clear that, guess what? The left isn't necessarily very good on being anti-militaristic. Noam Chomsky and others aside, the exception that may prove the rule very often, as well as present company accepted. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We will try to find that Boston Globe article and put it in the chat box. Also, the chat box has alerted me to the fact we have Michael Albert with us, and we'll be getting a question from him later, among others, during the Q&A, which we will get to after our next two speakers. I'm going to bring in our next speaker, Suzi Weissman. Suzi, I know you've been hosting a number of shows on Jacobin Radio and elsewhere, perhaps, on this topic, with a particular focus on the politics and economics of Russia, not just Putin, but the kind of regime in Moscow. What does the situation look like to you right now, Suzi, and what do you want to highlight from it? And after that, we'll turn to Keti Chukrov, who's actually in Moscow as we speak. But first, Suzi. Suzi, we just unmuted you. We're asking you to unmute, and then we can hear your thoughts. Sorry to make you start again.
Can you hear me now? So sorry. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very impressed with to be with this group, and I'm looking forward to all of the discussion. I think that there's a lot of takeaways, and I'm really happy for the way that it's been framed so far. And first we should just say we're 3 weeks into this war, and the shock of the actuality of the war is now shifted to the shock of the brutality of the carnage of this war. And there's no other way to describe it, I think, other than to say that this is a criminal human tragedy that suddenly and radically has escalated the danger in the world. And that's something we have to think about. Even as, prior to this war, we were thinking about the devastating climate report that came out that said that we have just 8 years left to start to address the cutting fossil fuel emissions in half. And that discussion seems to have been shelved right now because we have a much more important discussion. And unfortunately, we've seen so much of the left trying to, just say, okay, well, it's the US and NATO's fault. and ignoring or twisting themselves into pretzels without, being able to look at what's really happening and what Russia is doing. And I think that's really important. And it's also important to say that Putin's reckless adventurism has backfired, and it's backfired in a number of ways, but nonetheless, the human cost is enormous in Ukraine and in Russia and in beyond. And his miscalculations are also numerous. And I have a lot to say about this, but I'll just try to go through some of it very quickly. One, that Putin thought this was going to be a cakewalk, and that he could do, like the US, some sort of shock and awe, and that perhaps it would end in 1 to 3 days. Should also say that no one, except for American and British intelligence, thought that this war was actually going to take place. Everyone saw the massing of troops and the bluster and thought that somehow something would happen, and before the escalation or before the actual hostilities took place would start. But in any case, from what we know, Putin apparently also thought that at most it would be a 1 to 3 day, perhaps 10 days at the outset, and that he would just, he would conquer. We can see this in many ways. He didn't prepare the population. He didn't tell the troops, where they were going or what they were doing. They thought that this was a military exercise. He only seems to have alerted China on February 4th during the Olympics. He went to see Xi Jinping and seems to have gotten some kind of tacit approval for this. And other than that, and the only thing we know there is that Xi Jinping told them to wait till after the Olympics. But the other huge miscalculation is that Putin didn't think the Ukrainians would fight back, nor that their military equipment would be more advanced than Russia's. And that's thanks to extreme corruption. And with, as we now know, something like 50% of the gigantic military budget was stolen, siphoned off. It's in the oligarchs' holdings and real estate and God knows what else. That also, Putin didn't seem to think through should he win, what a post-war situation would be. He doesn't have enough troops to occupy Ukraine. It would be like swallowing a porcupine now that people actually, are more hostile than before. And there's no puppets for him to find in Ukraine that would run the government, in a pro-Russia way. He's managed to unite even a very fractured Ukraine against Russia for this action. And so, but I want to say the other side of it is I don't think this is going to come to pass, because I think Putin is losing this war. He's not winning militarily. He's not been able to take over the country quickly. He has, in any way, he's deployed, and I shouldn't say the Kremlin has deployed missiles, rockets, bombs. They're destroying apartment buildings, hospitals, schools, factories. The carnage is increasing, as well as we know, the refugee crisis with more than 3 million people leaving and many more millions displaced internally. And we will see more millions trying to leave as well. But think about this as well. He's not been able to take any major city. He's been able to destroy Mariupol, and he's perhaps, done the same to Melitopol, and only Kherson, it seems to be occupied. Melitopol, they kidnapped the mayor. But even in those cities, you still have a lot of protest and a lot of sporadic action. So it's no easy cakewalk whatsoever. And I think Russia loses even if it wins. China will probably be the ultimate winner of this, and Russia will be more and more dependent on it. Maybe the US and NATO too, because their prestige has become enhanced because of this war. And then we can say that Ukraine loses even if it wins, because the cost of the war is immeasurable. Ukraine, as has been said, is a poor country, one that was an economic basket case ruled by rotating corrupt oligarchs, until Zelensky, who's emerged as a real kind of hero, someone who masters social media and has inspired the population and the world, and we have to say that. But figures like 100 billion in damage are being suggested. That's more than the country's hard currency reserves and more than the entire value of the country's economy. So, there's a lot of issues here. And at home in Russia, it's also caused, a lot of division. And we're seeing this gigantic anti-war movement, which is very inspirational. People are braving draconian consequences for going out and demonstrating and continuing to demonstrate. Now, as you probably all know, there's 15-year sentence for speaking out against the war. They're not allowed to call it a war. It has to be called a military operation. We've seen journalists quit on air, and we've seen independent outlets shut down, many trying to leave the country. And I, may come back to this, but the divide over the support for the war in Russia can basically be seen between those who get their news on television, where they get the propaganda, and those who have access to internet, where they're able to see other sorts of things. So I guess finally, I just want to say, in terms of an important takeaway, that this war marks the end of a historical period and the beginning of another in process of becoming. And we really have to come to grips with that. And we don't really know what it's going to look like, because, as I said, almost everything Putin railed against, he has created. He wanted to change the security apparatus and architecture of Europe. And now we see that NATO, whose reason for being seemed to be in question at the end of the Cold War, is now enhanced, and even Finland and maybe Sweden want to join it. So it's a very changed world, and it's one that Putin has misfired recklessly in bringing forth. So the last thing is to say that we've always, other speakers have talked about the divisions that existed within Ukraine. We've seen it in East and West, but even in East Ukraine now, people are not supporting this war and are joining the effort against it. And so that's, I guess, the only plus that we can think of is Ukraine is united right now, and they're united against Russia. And there's a big danger too, because if it turns into a hatred, then we don't know what's going to come next. So I'll just leave it there and come back, later for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Suzi. So much outlined there in a brief amount of time. Really appreciate that. And I think you've given us a great transition to our final guest speaker before we open things up for a little bit of roundtable between the speakers, and then welcome you all on this live Zoom into Q&A. On that note, actually, if you do have a question that you'd like to ask the speakers, please indicate that in the chat. We have a lot of interesting questions as well. If you want to send a note in all caps to one of our hosts to make sure we can call on you and don't get lost in the chat, feel free to do that. Even if you've already posted your question, we'll be coming there before too long. But before that, Keti Chukrov joining us from Moscow. Keti, what does the situation look like to you? What about the situation do you want to highlight that you don't think maybe hasn't been mentioned, or that other people need to be more aware of? Thank you so much for joining us today from Moscow in Russia.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And thanks to Suzi Weissman, who actually described the situation excellently, so I don't have to add anything. Just to tell that the doors of certain colleagues of mine are now covered by swastikas simply because they are critical, so they have to flee. And it's not, the left have always been used to criticize their own internal Western context, Western imperialism, the policies of Pentagon, the policies of NATO. But imagine that you are at the end of 30s. What side would you take? Would you be with the benign imperialism or the malign imperialism? So we have this choice at the moment. Western benign imperialism, which the post-Soviet states were even aspiring to when they wanted to become part of the West after the demise of the Soviet Union. For instance, Georgia wanted to become part of the EU, Ukraine wanted to become part of the EU, or the malign, oligarchic, archaic, national imperialism, which is not even imperialism in the proper sense of the word, because a proper empire is expanding in terms of colonizing certain countries without expanding its own nationality. And Russian empire has always been expanding its own Russianness, imposing it on the others, which can be called Russian chauvinism, and which Lenin criticized harshly, and which today Kremlin historians are disputing, saying that Lenin actually spoiled the project of Russian world that could expand. And this expansion of Russian world is depicted as the protection of the Russian world. So imagine this Jesuit logic of imperialism, which expands, and this expansion is called the only savior of this country when it makes all others Russian. So why I started with this, because I mean, at the moment, definitely this internal critique, I'm also the left, an internal critique of the American policy, of the EU Brussels policy goes without saying. But at the moment, we are at the crossroads when we are between two evils, a more malign evil and a less malign evil. And this was the situation with Georgia, when we had some sort of liberal democratic government that stands for the EU and capitalist pro-American values, or the oligarchic pro-Putin government that totally brings everything to autocracy. So I would disagree here with Avi Chomsky that there is no division between autocracy and democracy. We came to the moment, and I didn't want to believe it because I was always drastically and radically critical of representative democracy, of course, claiming that it's a false democracy. But at the moment, we are at the threshold when we have to admit that this false representative democracy that keeps certain sort of freedoms, liberties, even if they are hypocritical, is still functioning in comparison with total collapse of all rights that the regions, humans might have. Another point, maybe I will speak a little bit longer because it is important. Another thing that I want to emphasize is the confusion with the term empire and USSR. USSR definitely contained imperialist rudiments and elements, but de jure, juridically, it has never been an empire. It was ideocratic union of Soviet states, and this is the reason why it could form another hemisphere. So why it could be another pole? It could be another pole that confronted the hegemonic pole of the US, because it was never a territorial or geopolitical pole. It was the pole of ideas, like democracy confronting communism. And nowadays, Russia functions as a territorial, geopolitical, Eurasian project that claims ethnicity as the root of its own expansion. And interestingly, I want to emphasize this. You know that until 1943, the hymn of USSR was international. And international claimed that the main idea is the liberation of proletarians and the class struggle. In 1943, the text of Russian hymn «Союз нерушимый республик свободных сплотила навеки Великая Русь», which means that the union of free countries were glued by great Russia. So how can the free countries be glued by great Russia? And this is how you get, instead of Leninist model of international and the Soviets, the Stalinist model, which of course has to keep the socialist idea, but imposes on it the idea of Russia as ethnicity gluing those Russian states. This is the reason why the post-Soviet decomposition was so emotional and so negative about Soviet imperialism and becoming anti-communism. This is why anti-communism was identified with liberation from this Russian ethnicity gluing all other countries. Although I disagree that juridically Soviet Union was this nationalist empire. Now, the idea that certain left were supporting even Putinist politics, and in Latin America too, because Putin was to a certain extent confronting the US, right? And they saw the NATO and US as the rival. But I would emphasize here that there were no conditions in the present Kremlin or Russia to produce this ideocratic, the new idea to be another hemisphere. So it's de facto the situation when, yes, the US can be the only pole at the moment. It's not good, of course, but the pretensions of Russia to become the second pole when Russia is totally devoid of socialist idea and totally devoid of its communist undercurrents, leaves us with this nationalist and chauvinist ambitions, which bring us to the situation. What is better in 1939 without putting labels? Germany or the US? Of course, I would choose US.
Thank you, Keti. Keti Chukrov, folks, speaking with us from Moscow. Keti, I want to give Avi Chomsky a chance to just reply or clarify her remarks from earlier, since you mentioned her. But before doing that, I wanted to echo something you just said about this kind of, it speaks to something I've been seeing a lot in social media, which is this conflation of a certain anti-communist notion of the Soviet Union and communism with contemporary Russia. One humorous but frightening, outrageous example of this came from the University of Florida recently. I don't know if people saw this going around, where the Marx reading room was announced by the university will be renamed. An official proclamation came out from some dean saying, in light of the situation in Ukraine, we don't feel it's appropriate to have staterooms named after Karl Marx, right? Which just speaks to the prevalent confusion, at least among the center and the right in this country, perhaps even among liberals, about a Soviet Union that still stood or was attempting to, or even claimed to stand for socialism or communism, and the contemporary Russian state, which you have talked about as pushing a Eurasian, ethnically kind of invoking project. So I just think that's a very important point that we need to make. This is not the Soviet Union here, right? Even, we have covers of magazines calling Putin the new Stalin, right? Because Stalin just means evil figure, I suppose, here. But I mean, that's a longer conversation, but I just wanted to really appreciate that point that you're making. But then I do want to give Avi a chance to just briefly respond, and then maybe we can give the whole panel a chance to respond to one another, including Keti. I can tell you want to say more about this very topic. So, but first Avi, and then back to maybe Keti and the panel before we bring it to Q&A. Avi? Make sure you are unmuted.
I'm used to teaching where I always keep myself unmuted, so I let
Well, it's the weekend. It's the weekend. We can be sloppy Zoomers on the weekend, I guess. We're not working, right? Yeah, right. Haha. Okay, bye. Yeah.
So yeah, I want to thank all of the last speakers for really, really interesting and provocative and diverse ways of approaching and thinking about these issues. I did want to return to this question of left and right and democracy and autocracy, because I think it just raises so many things. And again, I come at this kind of from a Latin Americanist perspective. And noting that in Latin America and in the US discourse, just watching what's happened to the US discourse, during the Trump years, of course, was the sort of liberal Democrat anti-Trumpism associating Trump and Putin with autocracy and seeing them as like almost unifying them. And then, we also see in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro as part of this, from the liberal democratic perspective, this perhaps troika of autocrats. So I also feel that like there's a lot of internal politics going on in the United States between Democrats and Republicans trying to situate themselves. And as the defenders of, the Republican Party is just sort of disintegrating on different lines, but certainly the liberal Democrats trying to associate anti-Trumpism with anti-Russianism, with war fever and calls for a no-fly zone, and that there's this sort of way of defining a particular kind of let's make the Democrats look strong against autocracy because the midterms are coming up. So, when I was making my comments about using that, I feel that in US political discourse, these terms are being thrown around. The United States always needs an official enemy. So whether it's communism or whether it's terrorism or whether it's autocracy, I feel like the term is practically meaningless in the way it's used in US political discourse, because it's simply a way of identifying an enemy rather than a description of anything that's actually happening. And I guess I was also coming at it from I guess I also find it really troubling, and this is kind of what I was trying to say at the beginning, the concept that trying to analyze and understand automatically puts you sort of in the position, oh, well, then you're defending Russia. I mean, I wanted to know why the United States invaded Iraq too. I didn't support it. I wasn't trying to justify it, but I do think we need to say, okay, why right now? Why, what changed in 1990? What changed in 2008? What changed in 1994? What changed in 1998? What changed in 2005? What changed in 2014? Why are we seeing this invasion now? I think that's important both politically and historically. And Russia, if there is some ancestral Russian ethnic project that goes back to pre-Soviet years, that has expressed itself in very different ways in different moments. So I would love to hear people talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. What is so uncanny today? Why the Chechen war, or even the Georgian war in 2008, or even the bombings of Iraq or the Belgrade, which were also atrocious and awful, cannot be compared to the present situation. Well, to start with, Zelensky is not Saddam Hussein, and nor is he Gaddafi. Although I totally, I find this absolutely atrocious, something that NATO united about. But let's start that this happened still in the 20th century, right? What happened in Syria was different from the peaceful country, which is relatively peaceful country, which is Ukraine. And I want to remind you the demise of the Soviet Union, because I come from this region, Abkhazia in Georgia, which was annexed by Kremlin. All my relatives became refugees. And I, as a Georgian, cannot travel there only because I have a Russian passport. Maybe I could visit it. But what is interesting that Georgia didn't want to become part of NATO, but it had to develop this aspirations up to 1903, 1904, there was no project of NATO, no discussion of the expansion of NATO. But this war and this annexation happened with the help of the Kremlin troops, even de jure, even though de jure this region was part of Georgia, in 2008, Kremlin ended up this juridical situation, claiming that it is annexed and it violated for the first time the international law, claiming that it is Russia without any United Nations or without any discussion at the United Nations that decides which country will have independence. So this is the problem. Another thing that I would like to emphasize with the specificity of the present situation is that, you know what, this transition from just imperialism to something more atrocious, I don't want to use this word, I'm afraid of this word, but you know which word I mean when I refer to 30s. You know, this transition happened in 3 weeks, in several days. And all of a sudden we discovered that something that was marginal, for instance, the ideas of Alexander Dugin, the ideas of Alexander Prokhanov, these absolutely utopian marginal ideas about golden age of Third Rome, when Moscow is becoming the Third Rome and the new sacred empire, they became the discourse of government. And this is what is dangerous when we hear the ideas that the historical borders of Russia are in fact the borders of the Soviet Union. And this is really phantasmagoric, and this was really, really something new.
I'd love to ask you just a question about that because, and I really appreciate all of your remarks, but, you know, this notion that if we listen to Putin's speeches, for example, that he wants to push for some 19th century concept of empire to restore Russian power and prestige, you know, and and then so many in the West accidentally, you know, say Soviet Union, even they can't just say Russia, they constantly hearken back to the Soviet Union. I think it's really important to stress that Putin admires Pinochet. You know, he hates the communists. He blamed Lenin for the creation of Ukraine and this policy of self-determination. And he talks about denazifying Ukraine. And he also then in the same breath talks about decommunizing, you know, so it's just a mix of words. And I think we have to really get what he means, because when I talk to my friends in Russia, they say all this talk about NATO and about empire is a fig leaf. And what really is important to Putin is maintaining power, because the standard of living has been going down. Inflation is rising. He's had to manage the elections, which is to say in the 2019 elections, he lost in many, many constituencies. Some people say in every constituency, and the results were reversed. And now he's had to manage the media to the extent that he shuts down any unofficial or independent media and manages what people see on the screens. And I have several questions. One is like, how long can he manage this kind of lie? Because Russians and Ukrainians are, you know, intricately united, as we've heard from other speakers. 1/3 of Russians have relatives in Ukraine, and they get on the phone and they ask them, and that you can only say for so long that there is no war, that this is just a military opposition, when soldiers are not going to come home and relatives are leaving the country. So he will not be able to maintain this facade for long. And I think that's very important in trying to understand the divide within Russia between those who get their news on TV and those who have access either to internet or perhaps relatives and actually believe what they say. And I've kind of rambled on, but I'm very interested in your conception of, whether or not this is just maintaining the kleptocracy in power, the Kremlin and those around Putin at any cost, and whether or not you think that this is possible. I think that this war is going to mark the end of Putin. The real problem is what happens if he's backed into such a corner that the only thing left is to push the nuclear weapon, the button, as we say, and I can't rule that out. And this will get into the other questions about what we in the world can do. I think what we have to all do is build gigantic anti-war movement. This is the only thing that can happen. Anyway, I've rambled, sorry.
Absolutely, and we want to come back very sharply and forcefully before this show is done to that question you've just flagged about what is to be done, what can be done at various levels. But before we go there and in between bring in the live audience, I want to give the rest of the panel a chance to respond to some of what's been said, and both the recent exchange here, but also in general. Olena, I understand you would like to respond.
Yes, I just wanted to underscore how we need to remember and tell our liberal-minded colleagues and people in our lives and communities here, also in the West, is that Putin and his elite is not a continuation of the Soviet Union in a sense, right? That this is a break, and also this is a product of the crisis of the Soviet state, but also importantly, the shock therapy neoliberal reforms in the 90s and continuously, right? This is where he really came to power in that context. In terms of an actual material, like, political economic example of how to classify this, right? I mean, Russian military in Mariupol, for instance, right? We have seen this on the news. So many videos, horrific images of what's happening there, right? But the Russian military has attacked hospitals and schools and universities and research centers. And, this is the public sphere, buildings, institutions built actually during the Soviet era, right? For public accessible use. And, I think that this is a form of expropriation of Soviet infrastructure, in fact. And I think it is correct to say, and we should underline the fact that the Russian regime as is now offers no hegemonic project that is universal, human, and emancipatory. I think we need to really, really emphasize this. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very good point by Olena, that something that was common good, I mean, all that infrastructure, whether energetic or production-wise, all of a sudden has to be privatized. And many researchers told me, I'm not a specialist in gas infrastructure or energy and electricity infrastructure, that the shift of Ukraine or the shift of Georgia towards the West meant total restructuring of energetic trajectories, which would be harmful for the Russian energetic companies, etc. So it's also the war. It's also the problem and the project of privatization of something that used to be common. And I would agree with this word, expropriation. Yes, indeed.
So,
yes.
Go ahead, finish, Keti, sorry.
Yes, but also something that Suzi put on table when she meant what would be the trigger in this immediate launching of the operation, which was constantly postponed. Well, there were some discussions here that on the one hand, NATO was just a subterfuge or an excuse to tell that, oh, all of a sudden this became impossible to endure, that the NATO is expanding. But for instance, 7 years, it was not such a burning issue, or 5 years, it was not such a burning issue. So it's also a subterfuge, but I would agree with my colleague Grigory Yudin, who said that much more it's the idea of no one interfering precisely into this oligarchic, kleptocratic absolutism, which has to be hermetized and become opaque for this transparency, in which this relative soft force of weak but representative democracy still functions in terms of international law or some kind of, I don't know, limits to your hubris and to your appetites, imperial appetites. But also another discussion was that probably among the insiders, there was the juxtaposition of certain clans, financial clan, military clan, and Putin was allegedly losing the influence among the financial clan, and he had to use the last argument by the war to emphasize that his power is his power. So there might have been some kind of decompositions of how his power used to work to use this last argument among the clans around him.
Thank you. So Jonathan, you wanted to say something also. And you have to unmute, Jonathan.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Well, I find some of this discussion very hard to agree with. I mean, here's how I see this. During World War II, there was a view of critical support by some on the left to the US effort against the Nazis, and there is some kind of hierarchy in these systems. However, I think there's a real serious danger to go too far with that. Barbarism is in the eye of the beholder. If you're living in Yemen or Syria or Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan and you have, some projectile coming towards your head, you're not going to be very nostalgic about the US and its incremental improvement over the Russian variety. So this really is in the eye of the beholder. Objectively speaking, yeah, I prefer the US system to what's going on in Russia. However, there's still another problem. If we go back to E.P. Thompson's book, Protest and Survive, we know that the critical left in Britain understood that there were two rotten apples here. And the other thing is, as I said in my piece, mutually assured paranoia, this goes back to the security dilemma in international relations theory, as well as perhaps Lenin's theory of imperialism about rival blocs. These two blocs are supporting each other, okay? The US bloc helped defeat certain democratic tendencies in Russia as they were restructuring, as they moved out of communism. And so they helped produce the little Frankenstein you have there in Russia, okay? By the same token, Russian barbarism, militarism, imperialism provides a lot of talking points for militarists in the United States, Sweden, Britain, throughout Europe, throughout the world. These two parties are supporting each other. They can't be separated. It's a bit to me like Coke and Pepsi with the incremental improvement of one of them over the other. I grant that, I concede that. Okay, but I mean, my forebears came from Ukraine, Belarus, and certain things over there didn't really necessarily change in the long perspective. Now, this has very essential importance for today's discussion about what to do to end this terrible war. And that is, there are people like at the Carnegie Endowment who argue that there's several games going on. There's the leadership of Ukraine trying to get a deal, and then there's NATO and the US. And some people argue, and this is something we should be debating, whether the US is going to hold out for things that won't benefit Ukraine, but will benefit NATO and the US. In that sense, the US again and NATO again is helping perpetuate the Russian barbarism. There's a dialectic here: mutually assured paranoia, mutually assured militarism. Bush recruited for Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda recruited for Bush, division of labor. This thing has been going on for decades and decades, the way these managerial thugs support each other, okay? However, I do agree the US system is better, but it's also contributing to the other side and vice versa. So to rank these in this way and go on and on about it, something about this bothers me very, very deeply. And basically these two societies need to move towards economic, media and political democracy, which we really haven't talked about that much which is what I would like to talk about. How do we change these societies that support the lowest common denominator? We have ecological things. This war, as terrible and brutal as it is distracting us from far more important things: ecocide, mutually assured destruction, et cetera, et cetera. I think we have to get at that some more. I feel very, very badly for what the Ukrainians are suffering, but the way in which we can all be dragged into this thing could be even worse. We have people wearing military uniforms getting on the national TV in Sweden saying, you know, we might be attacked, okay? And even if that's not true, and even if it's remote, it does help the militarists consolidate their power in this country and grab up the resources. So I'm equally offended by that, because we have very, very important things to do and we're wasting it in this way. And we really don't know what game is being played in Biden's White House that is prolonging this and helping and facilitating, confirming the paranoia and the militarism of Putin. There's a way in which these forces support each other we have to break out of. That should be the mission of the so-called left, or something that comes after the left, if you don't like that. Although I did love that Victor Serge book, I want to point out. I think that was great because he was getting at something that we should be talking about. E.P. Thompson, Victor Serge, Seymour Millman, these people, we need to think about. Simone Weil, who even argued that the left was soft on militarism. She went after Lenin in her famous essay about militarism. And I could say a lot of bad things about Lenin, but I will spare him for today. But if you force me, I'll say something. Well, thank you. That's
Jonathan,
the end of my intervention.
You're inspiring us to do maybe another show on militarism, confronting militarism more broadly. So obviously we don't have space for everything today, but I would appreciate you flagging that. I think Avi has a question building off of a question we got in the chat box earlier, a kind of a basic and clarifying question that Avi wants to riff on. And then I'm going to make the appeal to you all to put your Q&A, your questions in the chat box, or write to one of the hosts directly, so we can either call on you or we can read that question for you. Please indicate if you'd like to read it yourself. Avi, one question before we go to the group.
Yeah, so I don't think everybody has to respond to this, and I'm not sure who wants to respond, but Timothy Havel asked a question about the ethnic linguistic makeup of Ukraine. And obviously, many of us are not experts on Ukrainian or Eastern European history or contemporary realities. So I was wondering if at least one of the speakers could clarify that for us quickly. And I also wanted to add to that, to say something about the ethno-linguistic nature or not of Ukrainian nationalism as it's currently configured. So I will open that to any of the speakers here.
Great, a crucial question. I was watching an NBC clip the other day, and they featured great footage brought to them by the Azov battalion. Actually, videos that the Azovs were taking. Now, Facebook has allowed the Azov battalion, right, the one wing of this extreme nationalism, to kind of blur in with all the rest. So can you help us to parse the Russian, Ukrainian ethnic and national history, as well as the Ukrainian nationalism? It's a tall task, but who wants to? I'm buying you time here, actually, is what I'm doing. This is filibustering as well as whatever else I'm saying. So anyone want to take a stab at that in a minute or two?
I see Suzi smiling.
even maybe a basic rundown on the Russian presence for those who just aren't following the situation too much, in terms of the different kinds of Russian presence in Ukraine and the way that can be mapped for those who are totally confused. Olena?
Yeah, I think that this is a question I feel like a lot of people ask, right? I would almost go against I would almost question the question itself, you know, if I can do that. But I would almost say, you know, and it's pretty, I mean, I think it's pretty pluralistic in the sense that obviously we all know that there's more Russian speaking people in Eastern Ukraine and Southeastern Ukraine.
But we don't actually all know that. Let me just say, you need to tell us that.
Sure. I'm no expert in this. So, but in terms of the sort of legacies of the Soviet Union, there are quite a lot of Russian-speaking people also divided in terms of like the urban, rural, right? So urban like cities, Russian-speaking. But I think that the interesting research on this too is that, of course, under Stalin there were Ukrainianization policies in schools in Ukraine, and also, in fact, in Western Russia, so Kuban and Krasnodarsky Krai and other like North Caucasus, there were Ukrainian schools there and Ukrainian education. So for instance, my grandparents know Ukrainian very well, but at home they kind of speak of a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, Surzhyk. So yeah, this would be my answer. I wonder if does this matter so much? And can we really ethnically separate these people? I think a lot of people on the eastern side of Ukraine just as sound and look very similar to, people on the western side of Russia, like Rostov. These people eat very similar foods and sound very similarly. And I think the nation building making sort of project now on both sides, I think it's very, we should question it, and challenge it as is. And I think that, yeah, I think that would be my answer. Yeah, but there's so much more to say, and I'm no expert in this. Yeah.
Suzi, did you want to add something, or was I just guessing?
Well, I would just add to it, I detest nationalism, and unfortunately that's being bolstered on all sides because of this conflict and literally because of this history. One of the contradictions that we've seen in Putin's statements is that he says that there is no such thing as a Ukrainian nationality, but yet he's going to war against this Ukrainian nationality. So, there's every kind of contradiction. And just to echo too what Olena said, if you read any of the memoirs from the 30s, especially from those in Ukraine, and they talk about how every year all the school books had to be changed because one year you could teach in Ukrainian language and the next year you had to teach in Russian language. And of course, everybody spoke both languages at the time. And if, for those of us in this crowd, a lot of us consider ourselves Russian Jews, and we are now all of a sudden, a lot of people are looking where we came from. I'm from Eastern and Western Ukraine. And but if I asked my grandparents, they spoke Yiddish and they didn't want to consider themselves, either Russian or Ukrainian, unfortunately, because they were, in the Pale of Settlement and forced, to be nothing more than Jews. So, that's neither here nor there. I think the one real issue that we need to all worry about is what could come from this. And because the left is weak everywhere, and we have to just say that, we can make all of these statements, but we don't have a lot of influence. We need to build that influence. But, I just was speaking to a friend in Russia yesterday who said that there's an alarming rise, of fascist sentiment there. We see that here in the United States too, and we see it everywhere, that the right often is the beneficiary of these kinds of conflicts. And that's why, I really want us to go more into understanding what is going on. I also want to highlight, there was a wonderful article that appeared in the New Republic that asked, by two East Europeans who said they're tired of the West-splaining of Ukraine, where we try to determine what should be and what should not be for Ukraine, when every single issue that's in front of Ukraine right now, in terms of East and West, in terms of Crimea, in terms of Donetsk and Luhansk, all of these have to be left to the people themselves to decide who they want to ally with and how they characterize themselves.
Thank you so much, this great panel. As I said at the outset of the discussion, I hope this is the first of a number of discussions we can have on this topic, not necessarily Ukraine only, but this nexus of issues that's being surfaced here. We have a number of very patient folks that have been waiting to ask questions. I'm going to try to take a couple of them at a time to maximize the number of voices. First off, we're going to have Matt Callahan, who is also a comrade, a scholar, independent scholar, musician. I have to say, Matt, thank you so much for giving us the song with which Shelter and Solidarity begins each episode. And also thank you for putting us in touch with Keti Chukrov, who is playing such an important role today. We're gonna have Matt, and then I want to let David Kyle know. We'll be going to you soon, and then we'll also be relaying one other question from the chat box. And I see we have another couple folks with hands up. We'll check in with you soon. But first, Matt.
Okay, first of all, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to stick to one basic question. And this is mainly directed at Keti and Olena, because I want to know about the Communist Party of Russia and the Communist Party of Ukraine. I understand that Communist Party of Ukraine has been, it's criminalized, its leaders are in prison threatened with execution, or so I have heard. I spoke with Keti before this in regards to what the Communist Party of Russia is actually doing. I'd also like to amend the question with why doesn't the left talk about the communist parties? Are they completely in the pockets of the oligarchs? Are they not communists at all? Are they, what are they?
Yes, this is precisely what I wanted to mention. Actually, sadly, when the liberal or neoliberal governments in post-Soviet context were overtaken, for instance, in Georgia by oligarchic governments, the left sided with the oligarchy. Why? Because they are against neoliberalism. And of course, neoliberalism is the greatest rival. So they would rather side with the oligarchy because the oligarch is benevolent to the poorest. He is very generously protecting the poorest. So this language of protecting the poorest was very essential for Putin as well. And that this is one of the reasons why he has such a big electorate among the unprivileged layers of society. I don't want to comment on Donetsk and Lugansk. I'm not the specialist, but I would mention about Abkhazia. The left supported annexation of Abkhazia because Abkhazian people are the oppressed. So the left have to support the oppressed but obliquely they support the Kremlin's politic to divide and rule. So this is a conundrum that we cannot solve. But another guilt of the liberals is that it is also true that before Putin's term, the living conditions of people were worse. Maybe because they were worse because the oil was much cheaper, but generally this sticking to at least some remainders of the Soviet infrastructure in healthcare, in salaries, in housing. This should be mentioned that this was somehow kept by the Putin's government. Of course, it does not mean that they are not most vicious oligarchs, corrupt and simply stealing the budget. But at least they were dealing with some little remainders for those unprivileged layers. But this is what the oligarchs are doing. This is what the Tsar is doing. This is what the king is doing. You will have at least something, and people can be muted because they are not completely hungry, like with the liberals or the Yeltsin government, which was totally ignoring the strike of the miners, for instance, and people who didn't have any salaries for months on end. So I think that this minimal protection, this minimal benevolent protection was something that won the oligarchy the right for the support from below. As for your question, Matt, about Communist Party of the Russian Federation, who are now completely supporting the foreign policy of the Kremlin and this disappoints everyone who considers herself a communist. Well, this is the status quo that they chose, and I think they cannot be called communists in these conditions.
Thank you so much, Keti. I'm sure there's lots of thoughts on the panel here. I want to get a couple more questions from the audience, and we will go back to the panel again before we close around 3 o'clock. So right now we have two folks on the call who have indicated they want to speak, and then a third who put something in the chat box. Let's just go with the two that are still present with us. First will be David Kyle. David, I think I helped you unmute. And then after that, we will go to Bronislaw.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the speakers to comment on the 8-year NATO financed war. I consider it a proxy war against Russia, but it's also a war against Eastern Ukraine and Russian speakers there. The media has completely ignored this for the most, that is, has nearly entirely blacked it out. Only the last month of the war has any interest to the media that we are hearing, and therefore I think we have a war psychosis, and our job as leftists is to help a war psychosis subside by calling attention to the reality, which is that our militaristic government is intervening heavily in Ukraine. We can build a movement. What kind of a movement shall we build? Shouldn't it be laser focused on our own government's intervention?
Okay, thank you, David, especially the end of that very, very sharp question. I want to bring in Bronislaw too, to give you the panel 2 questions to respond to. I also want to welcome Olena when we do go back to the panel. If you'd like to speak to the prior question from Matt regarding the left parties in the region, the communist parties in particular, I got the sense you wanted to speak to that as well. But first, Bronislaw.
Yes, thank you very much. I am myself from Poland, and I would like to address my question to our colleagues from Russia and from Georgia. Of course, in Poland, there is at present big, I mean, everyone expects that Poland is the next, right? And Baltic states as well. Consequently, during those times of war, it occurred to me that maybe one way to avoid the future problems, because of course the West, the NATO is here more successful, right? And one can expect quite strong impact if really Russia falls down as it may. So my question is, would in Russia a following idea be interesting, namely, from the point of view of Poland, right, which is in between those two, it seemed to me that one of the best solutions would be if one could get a compromise in which the bulk of Russian army would withdraw behind Ural in exchange for elimination of NATO in Europe. This way, we might have gotten a Europe from Atlantic to Ural, possibly streaming towards some more general peace, which seems to me is the only way in which we can get out from this problem, right? So my question is, would the idea in which a compromise, say now, of course, is a conversation between Ukraine and Russia, but if that couldn't be extended to the idea in which we make the whole Europe empty of arms, and then, of course, Russia can take part in deciding, whatever it wants with Europe, right? But without military presence. Would such idea be welcome or not?
Can I answer? Or
Yeah, but I just wanted to.
no, Alina, please.
Yeah, just to make sure that all 3 questions don't get lost here. So David Kyle asked about what do we do about a media situation in the United States that is just kind of whitewashed away the whole 8-year war in Eastern Ukraine and the U.S. and NATO funding there. What is the obligation of a U.S. And Western anti-war movement? Isn't it to target NATO directly, right? And then the question from Bronislaw about a broader compromise, disarmed Europe. Also, to tag on with that, Friedrich, who has left us, but who gave a chat box question asks a broader question I think you could all step into as well. What is your opinion on how the carnage can be stopped? And who might have the ability or political will to stop it? It seems to be the broader question that Bronislaw and David, to some degree, are speaking to. But Olena, do you want to, before we take that, you want to speak to the left parties of it, and then we'll take that big one together?
I think that, just like Keti said about Abkhazia, I think that there was quite a bit of actually support on the left, and even now I see some posts sometimes, you know, of people being like, well, this is an kind of an anti-imperial movement or something in the Donbass region, you know. Of course, it's quite contradictory, you know, these kinds of statements, because I don't see a radical project from below being built there in any way, or you know, like attempted redistribution or attempted kind of socialism. You know, if that was the case, I mean, I think, yeah, great, but that hasn't been the case in the last 8 years, you know. So what's going on there? And we need to ask this question. So no, I would disagree with that. The silence on Donbass, and I think a lot of people who have been stranded in this war for 8 years, including my own, you know, relatives who live there on the other side of the border. I mean, I think they are very angry that when their children were bombed or were in the line of fire, nobody really gave a shit, you know. Sorry for my, you know, language here, but in a sense, I think people are angry about that, and I think rightfully so. But that doesn't mean that this is one thing doesn't mean the other, and we can hold two thoughts, you know, at the same time, right? So this would be my comment on that. The other comment, the other thing I wanted to mention about the Communist Party of Russia, which right now, yes, has officially supported the operation, you know, in quotation marks. But I think that in the last election round and the protests on the streets, right, in Russia, the Communist Party actually played an interesting role. Maybe this is the right word or not, but it was almost infiltrated by you know, social democrats, new communists, new left, and made some headway in getting elected in certain neighborhoods, right? And you know, I think that's a very interesting way of using the Communist Party and using the nostalgia for the Soviet Union and this kind of Communist Party, which they all internally disagree with, these candidates, you know, but at the same using it as a kind of legitimate way of making some gains and going against and challenging the United Russia Party, right? So that's one way to think about how it can be used. I think in this context of the war, I absolutely agree with Keti that, you know, the Communist Party cannot call itself communist and do this, you know. Absolutely. Yes,
we had hopes, Alina, we had great hopes for this new wing of KPRF, but everyone expected something from them, but now we don't see this wing, right?
Yeah, I agree, and this is a big you know, disappointment. In fact, of course, so many candidates in elections, they were arrested also, and, you know, brutally beaten and so on, right? And these were communist what's the word in English? Sorry, not leaders, but on the ballot, right? Communist candidates. Sorry. So so this was a first. I think that's the first in history, you know, of contemporary Russia, of post-Soviet Russia, that this happened. I think, yeah, there were lots of hopes for that. But if you're interested in what happened to the left in Russia, there's a very new, fresh book in verso by Ilya Budraitskis, and it's called Dissidents Among Dissidents. And I think it speaks to some of these contradictions on the Russian left and the way forward, both kind of an anti-old communist party, but also anti-liberal humanism that's on the left in Russia today. So I'll put a little link in here in the chat to this book.
I just want to come in and echo that, because Ilya Budraitsky's book is very, very good. And from everybody that I talk, there's a giant, not a giant, but there is a spectrum now of the left in Russia itself: anarchists, socialists, Trotskyists, social democrats, and they're all united against the war. And even the KPRF, the Communist Party, is divided. There's 4 different, communist parties. You can look at Robkor and see some of these discussions. So, there's, I think what you could say is that that Putin has created there's so much revulsion at what's going on that, there is a left that perhaps, hates not just the kleptocracy, but also the neoliberal decline. And one thing that pushed everybody, into more opposition to Putin was this pension reform that took place. And that literally was seen by people as just stealing their retirement and adding, 5 more years before they could retire. So, it seems that I go back to my original thing that, that I think that this war is a lot about trying to deflect from these incredible economic and political constraints at home. I think the other real important question that's come out, and thanks to Bronislaw for bringing that up, is what can be done now to stop this war? And this is where we really have to kind of think about, like, what are the conditions that would lead to a ceasefire? And what, so much of what we hear in the West is that Ukraine has to accept partition, or that, and I'm so glad that Olena brought up the Donbass region, where, many thought that this was a burgeoning workers' republic, but it's been, there's more unemployment, half the people have left, the working conditions are worse. It's just not that at all. And I think, there was 8 years of war and 14,000 deaths, and half the population left, and Russia didn't lift a finger to help these independent republics that they now all of a sudden, recognize. So there's so many problems, I think, that we need to consider about how the left worldwide can, maybe have some voice by mobilizing into the terms of the ceasefire and into the kind of configuration of the world that we hope that grows out of this. I know it's a gigantic question, but it's something we have to think about.
Others on the panel that would like to speak to this broad questions about David Kyle's question about the importance of targeting NATO within anti-war movement, at least here in the United States or in the West, this issue of what a broader settlement could look like, a compromise formation that could demilitarize Europe. Before we take a couple more questions, maybe a last round of questions from the audience, would anyone else like to
I have a very short comment. Given that we have sinocentrism, a very strong sinocentrism, demilitarizing Europe is not realistic. De-NATOization of Europe. Because, I remember how NATO was becoming an existential issue. It was like ancient Greece for Germans, for Georgians. So NATO was not some military alliance which the left have to criticize, but for Georgians who want to just bid farewell to their Soviet background, NATO was some kind of passage to new civilization. Of course, they were idealizing it, but something like that existed in Eastern Europe too. And Eastern Europe still exists in this context of keeping this guarantee as the possibility of integration within the so-called civilized world. I'm saying something in a very banal terms, right? So a very common sense and layman thoughts, but these layman thoughts sometimes construct real politics.
Jonathan, you wanted to say something on this topic also. Unmute. Jonathan, you need to unmute.
There. Sorry, technical. First of all, I agree that NATO is not going to dissolve tomorrow and it's not going to pull out and all this. I mean, we're now at a situation where Finland and Sweden are trying to get into NATO. So the idea you're going to pull these others out is not. And Putin has made the job of getting rid of NATO somewhat difficult, I would say. So the question is, has to be addressed on some other term, like try to keep the nations that are not in NATO out, so that you could have the idea that you don't have to be on either side of the block. I mean, this is partially what part of the Olaf Palme non-aligned movement, all that stuff played some kind of role. There was some hypocrisy there because Sweden was selling weapons to India and all these other things, but it was the kinder, gentler hypocrisy, to quote George Bush. So that's the first thing. Where are the leverage points? Well, I think I think Ukraine is going to have to make some concessions. I think the Russians have to make some concessions, and the US and this expansionist thing that they're trying to do will have to make some concessions. So I think there's a way in which not having some concessions and trying to keep the higher moral ground, even, Tariq Ali said that there are painful choices that have to be made. He said this in the Democracy Now! Interview, and he spoke rather articulately about this. The Carnegie Endowment, someone named Acton, I believe is the name, he argued that a key stumbling point, as I tried to mention before, is this issue of the sanctions. What if Zelensky wants to make a deal and then the US wants more? I mean, then Ukraine is caught there between what the US wants, but Ukraine doesn't. And some of the things that Zelensky has said are not so helpful for us on the left, but he has to say them anyway. But we have to realize that not everybody's interests are aligned here. The other thing I want to say is to put this in historical perspective. The peace movement has been organized in a way that doesn't necessarily make it very effective. And this problem lasts decades and decades and decades. There's a book called How Effective Are Peace Movements? At one point, certain critics of the military argued that the peace movement was safe for the Pentagon. There's a new way that we have to organize things in order to accumulate power. And I believe that if we could align, as I said, this momentum around the Green New Deal, some of the demilitarization, even take in or try to co-opt some of the right-wing arguments against the war without falling into the trap of these Trump people. I mean, I think there's a space there that could be worked on. But if we use certain narratives in the past, we're not going to have any leverage about anything, much less this conflict. So I think we have to think about how to systematically accumulate power. And I think, one interesting thing would be as an experiment is to have different kinds of lefts debate each other. As I told you, this part of the Swedish left is moved into there are anti-militarists here in Sweden, but some of them have moved into the militarist column. So to have a different kind of left, argue with each other, I think would be interesting, because like there are Ukrainian leftists who don't like DSA because they were against sending weapons. This is kind of interesting how this works together. So I think that might be a basis of discussion. Let's remember World War I, where the various lefts aligned against each other, the French and the German on different sides. I think we're kind of falling into that again. Part of the reason is that we haven't had, I don't mean to sound like the broken record or CD or whatever, we haven't had a coherent discussion about anti-militarism. It's been subsumed under other isms, getting rid of capitalism, getting rid of the patriarchy, etc. How are we going to get rid of the militarist system? I think that intellectual project has been derailed systematically. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And again, I think you're flagging an important show we should do to follow this one up. Maybe some of you, if you will accept the invitation, we'll put you on that panel.
If drafted, I will serve.
All right, you're on. We've recorded that, so consider yourself invited. Okay, we're going to do one more round of questions from the audience, and then ask our panel to give us some closing thoughts about what can be or ought to be done now. And I think we'll hear it one more time from Alisa as well, from her video, the video that got things started. We have, I believe, Michael Albert, who was referenced earlier in the discussion here. Michael, haven't had a chat box from you, but if you're there, I'd like you to indicate, if you'd like to speak. In the meantime, I'm going to go to the other two folks because I don't see you on the screen right now, but Michael Albert is on the call and perhaps can join us in a moment. We have Jim Granger and Jennifer with two, I think, important, sharp questions to close with. Jim, can you unmute yourself? Jim Granger? All right, there you go.
Okay. Yeah. Jonathan, this is to dovetail onto what Jonathan was talking about, because with, whether to supply, in terms of arming Ukraine, with getting into militarism, because I think this, definitely the tension on the left is whether to arm or whether to not arm. And, just the way I view it is, Putin would, probably still invade even if we weren't, would still press ahead if they weren't arming. And I just look at the arms embargo back of during the Bosnian War. And, I'm just wondering, is it really wise to, again, there's just this tension. I just don't know whether we should arm Ukraine, or not, because I just, how can we resolve that tension, I guess, if Ukraine really should be solved? I know obviously a diplomatic, you want diplomacy to really work, but in the meantime, there is a war going on. So
sure. Thank you for that, Jim. I think a very sharp question, right? Should the US be arming Ukraine and or should the left be opposing or supporting that in what way or not? Jennifer, could you follow that up? And then we'll go to our panel if Michael Albert is not back. All right, Jennifer, just need to unmute yourself. And there you are.
Can you hear me? Okay.
We can.
Okay, so two really quick points. One about needing to explain or understand Russia's actions in Ukraine. To explain is not to justify. And that seems like a point of view and a perspective that's really under siege right now from a lot of people considering themselves liberal or left. I mean, it's even what came up a little bit in the chat. But I was very active in the '91 Gulf War, and also the 2003 Gulf War in opposing it. And, at the time, it was fine to totally scrutinize what US motives were and what the history of US-Iraq relations were. And you wouldn't, particularly by 2003, you wouldn't be accused of being an apologist for Saddam Hussein. But it's like we seem to have lost the capacity to have that level of discussion and debate now with Russia. So that's just one general point. But the second is, if in terms of the US, if we're thinking of ourselves as US-based activists, what is it, those of us who are that US-based activists, what we should do to keep the US from turning Ukraine into a military proxy state to basically attack Russia? And that would seem to me kind of front and center of what our activity should be. And in particular, considering that this may be the conflict that actually gets us a nuclear war, right? It may happen like a month or two down the road with refugees, but there's an element of urgency that I wish we could have that wouldn't tip over into panic or hysteria, but still have some urgency, to give us some focus to our discussions and activities. So anyway, but I'm wondering what people have to say about that, about how we should keep the US, because whatever is going on, it's not to endorse Ukraine or the Ukrainian leadership or the Russian leadership. But we obviously have an issue where the US foreign policy planners seem really intent and have been for at least a decade in turning Ukraine into basically a military proxy.
Sure.
So that's it.
Thank you, Jennifer. So two kind of opposed but paired questions, right? One about should the US be arming or should the left support arming or oppose arming Ukrainians to one degree or another? And then on the other hand, what can be done from an anti-war standpoint to prevent the United States from continuing or escalating the current militarization of Ukraine into an even more frightening place? Calls for no-fly zones may be buzzing in the back of our heads, which have been frighteningly moving from the extreme kind of fringe into mainstream discourse. A great and important question. I think all of us have been thinking about this from the beginning. Back to our panel for this, and I think maybe it is 3 o'clock, so we'll make this a double duty. Respond to those questions, and if you can, offer us a closing point on something that should be done at whatever level of activity you're imagining that, or maybe that should not be done. Perhaps it's easier to negate than to construct in this moment. I don't know if we want to go in the order that we began, and maybe we can close with Alisa's video. But so we would start then with Olena, unless someone else wants to jump in. Olena, would you be okay with it? Or does
Keti, go ahead. I can follow. Yeah.
Okay,
Actually,
Keti first.
I would
Keti,
like
Olena.
to react to Bronislav's and Jennifer's comment. I think that, of course, we are generally all pacifists, and we have to demilitarize, right? And there was a comment here that you cannot demilitarize or when you keep the capitalist state. So I would emphasize this, that while we have the national state, which is at the same time a neoliberal capitalist state, you cannot claim this demilitarization because these states, with their ambitions and pretensions, are constantly in confrontation, and including the proxy distribution. So I would say that in the conditions when there is the idea of constructing a new empire on the remnants of the Soviet project, the demilitarization and the absence of NATO in Eastern Europe would not help this. This is my opinion. Maybe you would not agree. But in terms of whether we should militarize or not militarize at the moment Ukraine, I would rephrase it. When your friend is in combat, would you help this friend or not? I mean, it's the question of supporting combat. For me, it looks like that.
Thank you. Olena?
Yeah, I think that there is a difference between supporting Ukraine, the peoples of Ukraine that are plural, you know, on the ground, fighting for their lives, livelihoods, for their households, joining territorial defense groups, etc., right, to defend themselves. I think there's a difference between that and between supporting the Ukrainian state as is. And I think maybe we need to think in that direction. I would say that, you know, as many Ukrainians are fleeing the war, you know, those who are not able to, they're, you know, left behind and they're continuing to die, right? But Ukraine today is no radical, you know, socialist, pluralist, inclusive, blah, blah, political project from below. We know that the Ukrainian state has been expropriating its own peoples, you know, for the last several years, as is happening in Russia, right? Russian people or citizens, you know, so I'm not sure, like, for their lives, we need to call for peace immediately, I think. And of course, the number one thing there is for the Russian troops to leave. So I think the anti-war protests in Russia are powerful, even if with such high numbers of arrests, people really, you know, endangering themselves coming out. I think, you know, this is a really important movement. But anyway, our number one demand must be for Russian troops to leave and for peace, you know. My other question, I'm not able to answer it really, but this is a question I'll put to you to everyone is, you know, if the US, Canada, the UK and the EU powers are sending lethal aid, think about that word, lethal aid, without any serious intentional push for peace talks, then I wonder what's going on here, and does this not continue the war? I think this is quite irresponsible. It is Ukrainians who are dying and who will live with the consequences of this war, right? We see again what was happening in Mariupol, and it's horrifying. Secondly, I think at this more kind of political leftist sort of level, I guess, we need to have an honest discussion about the contradictions here in what happened to the Minsk agreements? Is there a third Minsk that is possible or not anymore? And so on, right? And how much Ukraine has been militarized throughout this time. Anyway, and I think in solidarity with other anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements in the global South, I think that begins, you know, for Ukrainian left, I think that begins at home, right? And we need to ask a question, is it a white European state? Is it a, you know, how has the working class been implicated? Ukrainian working class has been implicated in the EU labor markets. And, you know, how is the Ukrainian state, you know, continues to expropriate and so on. And I think that we need to think of a Ukraine that is a pluralist project, that is redistributive. That's the question on the table. But the number one question, even to get to that question and to deal with the far right, like Azov and you know, the separatist republics and so on. What the first question, of course, the first thing is peace. And I think it's the first thing is for troops to get out of Ukraine.
Thank you, Olena.
Can I just come in on that? It was so eloquent, and I really appreciate actually all of the comments so far. This has really been a very good discussion, and I sympathize so much with what Jim Granger was saying, because I remember back, you know, during the wars in Yugoslavia that we were calling for arming the Bosnians. You know, 250,000 people died, and here we're seeing once again. I think we cannot lose track of the carnage, and it's carnage on both sides. Russian troops are dying too. And these are young conscripts. These are young boys who probably had no idea what they were doing. And then of course in Ukraine, and Putin's only response to his losing so far is to, you know, treat Ukraine as Grozny or as Aleppo and to just level it because he can't win it. And so, you know, this is the real question for all of us, I think, is right now. There has, you know, and just to finally, you know, sort of say that there's a drumbeat to war on, especially the U.S. media. It's just one after another, you know, commentator saying, yes, no-fly zone. Oh dear, maybe that would be World War III. But the real issue is that we have to, you know, find a way to stop the war immediately. That's the key thing. Stop the war, have a ceasefire, and then work out the negotiation, but stop the war, because this is the most dangerous war that we've faced, not just in the 21st century, but possibly, you know, in the world, because we have nuclear powers that are, and it's so, you know, I can't emphasize that enough. And thank everybody for all of their contributions.
Echoing that, Suzi, the thanks and the comments. We're going to go to Jonathan for our last panel comment, and then back to Avi for some reflections on the panel, and then we'll wrap things up here at Shelter in Solidarity on this Sunday afternoon. Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think the left, in at least Sweden and parts of the United States, depending on how you classify the left, have engaged in a Faustian bargain. It's the same bargain that was presented to us in Yugoslavia, as in the book, The New Military Humanism by Noam Chomsky has eloquently explained. It seems like we're trying to make things better, we make things worse. I commend everyone to read the work of Alan Cooperman, who has documented this in many locations, that the interventions have made things worse, and it seems like this is the case here. There is, just to emphasize the point, that if you give weapons, then the Russians will simply do more bombing and the carnage gets worse. There's a high degree of escalation, so it's not worth the risk for World War III to make some point about democracy. After all, you can resist with non-military means, even though the Russians are there, which we've seen examples of, which is part of the sensible Swedish debate about this. By sending the weapons and making the Faustian bargain and selling away your soul, you're strengthening the military-industrial complex, which is standing in the way, those interests of making a diplomatic agreement. If you gave more weapons and slowed the Russians, it would lead to more bombing, potentially more escalation. And even if you gave all the weapons you wanted in the world, there's a way the US could use the sanctions to block a diplomatic agreement. So any way you look at it, while there is something in all of us who, or at least me, who would wish the Russians would go away militarily or otherwise, I understand that, but from a rational, detached point of view, this is political suicide for the left to fall for that. Yet again, what should we do? Well, again, we have to focus on the media. In Sweden, and I believe in the United States, there's weakness in the idea of media accountability. I remember during the 2000, because I made some phone calls and investigated this, while the right wing was pressuring the media, even with direct action, to promote Bush and get rid of Gore, the left did no direct action on the media. This was what the right was doing to get their guy in there. The notion of how to engage the media through direct action, other kinds of accountability is very weak. Fortunately, you have fairness and accuracy in reporting as one system, but you have to go a little deeper. The other thing I think would have a media effect in a topical media space conjunctural way is that people like AOC and others in the Progressive Caucus join forces with some of these right-wing people who are against the war to show that this is a different kind of level of what we have to do. If they could do that, I think that would do a jujitsu on the Biden administration. That's extremely important. I think people have to swallow their pride and make that kind of Faustian bargain rather than the one with the militarists. That's what I think. Thank you.
Jonathan, some provocative comments, which I think hopefully will bring folks back to the next time that Shelter and Solidarity engages this question of which way forward for anti-militarism, title pending. We're going to go to Avi for some reflections. Avi, we started this conversation saying that we were, playing catch up and learning a lot about an area where we haven't been experts, but where the existential demands of the present demand it. Some thoughts on this, and then we're going to go to Alisa's video to close this out after Avi's comments, and then I'll let you know what's up with Shelter and Solidarity next. But Avi, and then Alisa in absentia. Avi, what do you think? What stands out from today's discussion that you want to highlight?
So I would really like to second a lot of the things that were just said in terms of where do we need to go, what do we need to do, that I've just found it so horrifying and grotesque, this sense that, oh, stand with Ukraine, support Ukraine by making sure more Ukrainians die. Just kind of following up on what Olena was saying, that people sitting comfortably in their homes are advocating policies that are going to be killing other people and saying that they're doing that to support those people. But I think that it's also really incumbent on us to ask some of the same questions that I and several others have been asking about Putin, about Biden, because I really do feel that he plays a big role in what kind of solution, and if Ukraine is going to be able to find a solution, if there's going to be a negotiated solution, obviously the United States is going to be playing a role. And already plays a role. So what are the motivating factors on Biden, the Biden administration, I should say, the Pentagon right now, in terms of its war fever and attempts to promote war fever? And how can we counter those in this country? And I can't really answer that question, but I can offer a few suggestions. I certainly think the way that the Biden administration is thinking about the midterms is playing a big role in the—
Avi, it seems that your audio just cut out the last two sentences.
Oh, sorry. I don't see why that would have
Are
happened.
other people having Avi's audio out, or is this on my side? I think this is—
Her video froze.
Okay, so Avi is— Okay, maybe on my side. I'm sorry about that. Avi, you continue.
Okay. I think that Biden and the Democratic Party are thinking about the midterms and not looking weak and not making themselves vulnerable to right-wing attack. And I definitely think that one of the reasons that NATO is so important to the United States is the arms industry. I think that one of the factors here was trying to bring Germany into the fold. And eliminating the Nord Stream, making Europe more dependent on US petroleum. I mean, I think that there's a whole constellation of issues that the US left has to be thinking about in terms of why is the United States so determined to sacrifice Ukrainians right now on some kind of vision that the US is trying to promote for Europe. So maybe we can do another show on that too.
Yeah, thank you, Avi. I think, wasn't it Dwight D. Eisenhower, of all people, who well, not only coined that term military-industrial complex or popularized it, but also said something along the lines of every gun or bomber plane that's built, right, it deprives us of a schoolhouse. I mean, I mentioned that not to romanticize Eisenhower, but to gesture towards what Jonathan provocatively left us with as well, and the possibilities that anti-militarists and maybe even anti-imperialists, or at least anti-war folks, can be found perhaps in many places, and including in some places where we're not used to seeking or finding political allies. And I do think that if we really do take seriously the existential threat of this moment, we have an obligation to reach out to unite as many people as we can to stop the most disastrous circumstances. Bringing us back to the human side of this, we're going to go to Alisa's video. This is Alisa LaSotnik, who again is joining us today via video because she is actually on alert to help Ukrainian war refugees from her place in Spain as she's working to settle people, including her own family, in this crisis. Seren, could you play that video for us, and then we'll close out?
In terms of mobilizing and steps forward, I'd like to comment that the response here across the EU from the people has really been phenomenal. While the EU has taken in more than 3 million refugees, that people have been just springing up out of the woodwork, calling me up, seeing what they can donate, whether it's money or blankets or canned food. Donations have been just stockpiled in warehouses and then thrown into vehicles, minivans, trucks, and delivered all across Europe to the border in Ukraine, emptied out and then being filled up with refugees and being brought back to Spain to be taken in by families, not only Ukrainian expats, but people here from Spain. And the response really has been phenomenal. And the government as well has opened its borders and has allowed refugees to get temporary visa status, temporary residency status, I should say, which lasts for 1 year and it can be renewable, right to work, support for finding shelter and supplies, and really expediting the process. And just seeing how people have gotten together and created a chain of support from the border to the very tip of here in Spain, just in sort of self-organized networks of apartments and donations and supplies and translations and transportation support and medical service has been phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it, and just shows what a circle of compassion that humanity is capable of, and it's quite frankly the freedom for that we are striving towards, of people supporting each other in need. In terms of mobilizing in the US, I think there are a number of points to bear in mind, and to have very clear the objectives of any demonstration is a large part of the Ukrainian community will be rallying for NATO involvement and for NATO to take Ukraine in, and so there may be some points of contention. However, there are things that the US could do that would be helpful, such as extending temporary visa statuses to family members, as there are so many people fleeing their homes and possibly won't have a home to return to, and are seeking asylum status in third countries, staying with strangers when they could be taken in by family members in the US. And that's something that could be extended if the US receives enough public pressure on the ground. Another point I'd like to make is that there's this tidal wave of disinformation or misinformation that's deliberate. And so any opportunity to clarify the facts, provide primary sources, explain the steps that led to this escalation, unfurling a map and understanding the key players and what their interests are, as well as connecting it to local politics, local economics, and, for example, here, understanding where EU gets its oil from and things like that. is very critical, as well as appreciating that there's a deep, complicated history here, and that cannot be overly simplified and reduced to just being a puppet state. There's a very complex tapestry of pressures and a multi-layered context here that cannot be undervalued. I'd also like to add that as demonstrations take place in an often one-sided argument sort of way, it's equally powerful just to sit down and break bread with people. And as perhaps you'll encounter folks from the Ukrainian community that maybe don't share the same politics as you, but are undergoing the worst anguish of their lives, and just having someone to hear them out, to listen to them, and not, try to just convince them of our point of view, whatever that is, it goes a long way to expanding that circle of compassion and dialogue, and helps build communities where people can trust each other and listen to each other, even if they don't share the same position on every point in the politics. Additionally, there have been members of the community here in the EU of Russian descent that have received a violent backlash from the conflict, which is really unfortunate for them to get caught in the crossfire of this kind of confused cultural antagonism, where quite possibly they've left Russia because they didn't agree with the government and should not be targeted as responsible for what that government is doing. I think those members of the community need to be protected. And finally, just talking about that freedom for and expanding that circle of compassion and building communities of self-organization. It's really, I think, the only way we can get through crises such as this one and everything else that our humanity is going through. And I'm very grateful for being part of this talk, and am available by email if I can be helpful in any other way. And I'm so grateful for everything that you're doing, from the depths of my heart. And I'll leave it here. So
Alisa
thank you very
LaSotnik,
much. Take care.
With us from video from Spain, taking care of Ukrainian war refugees, including her own family. We're going to wrap up the show here on Shelter and Solidarity. We will be hanging out for a few minutes after the show if you'd like to chat a bit more and connect with our guests and others beyond the recording of this 2-hour show. I want to close before going to Avi and just thanking all the guests here with the actual quote from that Eisenhower speech. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. A powerful sentiment, no matter who actually said it. Shelter and Solidarity is a space that tries to bring together folks who broadly on the left, but from a variety of different intellectual, scholarly, political positions, really moved by Alisa's closing call for compassion, for recognizing the complexity of a situation, and to really recognizing the need to connect and support and listen to other people, even in times, and maybe especially in times of great confusion and great anxiety. Shelter and Solidarity has been a space that's trying to help us keep our sanity as well as clarify our analysis for the last almost 2 years. We've done about 70 shows since the start of the pandemic. You can find us at shelterandsolidarity.org. Our Facebook page, Shelter and Solidarity, please like and share. We're getting no help from that algorithm, especially when we do critical content about issues like this. We have a YouTube channel as well, where the video from today's broadcast and all our broadcasts will be available. That's Shelter and Solidarity. Shelter and Solidarity is the channel on YouTube. The show would not have been possible without the SNS production team, Lena Durkin, Linda Liu, Kira Mudliar, Seren Mudliar, Rachel Yarishus-Patton, Mark Soderstrom. We would like to thank Avi Chomsky for being a great co-host today. Avi, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And to all of our guests, Thank you for being here. I hope we continue this conversation in whatever forms we have. Finally, I'm thanking our co-sponsors, the Community Church of Boston, a free community for the study and practice of universal religion, Encuentro Cinco, known affectionately as E5, a movement building project in downtown Boston, Hardball Press, a leading publisher of labor and social justice stories for adults and children. That's a hat tip for our former co-producer, Tim Sheard, over at Hardball Press. You can find them at hardballpress.com. The Liberty Tree Foundation, an organization serving the democracy movement for the revolution, democracy revolution rather. And finally, Socialism and Democracy, a journal that brings together the worlds of scholarship and activism.